All right, testing. Hi. We're going to get started here, so grab a seat if you haven't, grab some lunch if you haven't already, and welcome. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Abby Smith. I'm a climate policy reporter with Bloomberg Environment. This morning, we're going to talk about federal clean electricity tax credits with a set of distinguished experts. I'll introduce them in just a second. Let me first say that this event is also being webcast live. The full video will be available on Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy website in the coming days. And for those of you watching online, as well as those here in the audience, you can definitely ask questions. We encourage that. Anytime you can do that using the hashtag CGEP events on Twitter, or tagging the Twitter handle Columbia U Energy. And then later when we open it up for questions in the audience, you can just raise your hand and we'll call on you. So I'm going to introduce our experts here. We've got Dr. Noah Kaufman, a research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy. He's an economist who has worked on energy and climate change policy both in the public and the private sectors, including as the Deputy Associate Director of Energy and Climate Change at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. And then we've got Julio Friedmann, a senior research scholar at the Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. He recently served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Fossil Energy at the Department of Energy, where he was responsible for the R&D program in advanced fossil energy systems, carbon capture and storage, CO2 utilization, and clean coal deployment. His expertise includes large-scale carbon management, CO2 removal, CO2 recycling, oil and gas systems, international engagements in clean fossil energy, and international engagements within the U.S. government. He's also held positions at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, including Senior Advisor for Energy Innovation and Chief Energy Technologist. He's also CEO of Carbon Wrangler and Carbon Wrangler on Twitter, and is a Distinguished Associate at the Energy Futures Initiative and serves as a Special Advisor to the Global CCS Institute. So we'll get started. We'll start with some remarks from Noah and then some remarks from Julio, and then we'll have a discussion. So Noah, leave it to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Abby, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming and for your interest in our work. It's very, very cool to be here. So I thought I would start just to motivate our project and our paper by answering two questions up front. First of all, why are we talking about a carbon-free electricity system? And the answer to that question is climate change. So what I have up here in this figure is concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. For most of human history, concentration of CO2 was in sort of the 150 to 300 parts per million range, as you can see there. Now, in a very short period of time, we've jumped up to about 400 parts per million. Hasn't been that way in 2 or 3 million years, as you can see up there. So that's why things are starting to get a little weird out there. But of course, we ain't seen nothing yet. And if we continue down this pathway later this century, this will do something like double, something like 700 to 900 parts per million. That would put us in totally uncharted territory for human civilization. So we would have to be sociopaths to take that sort of gamble with the fate of human civilization, right? We're not sociopaths, are we? I don't think so. So that's why we're going to decarbonize. Second question, why are we talking about tax credits in particular? Honestly, this is our attempt to meet policymakers where they are. We're not saying this is the #1 policy priority. We're also certainly not saying that it's a comprehensive climate strategy, even if we're talking about the whole power sector. Remember, that's less than 1/3 of all of our emissions. But clean electricity tax credits are sort of a rare example of a policy tool that can be both effective and receive bipartisan support, at least as history suggests. So this has been true looking backwards, most prominently with the investment tax credit and the production tax credit, which I have a figure here just sort of showing the deployment of wind and solar energy over the last 10 or 20 years, combined with the expenditures from the ITC and PTC over that time. And you see them both ramping up quite a bit over the last couple decades, some part due to these federal tax credits. And then this bipartisan sort of push on tax credits still exists today. We have congressmen on both sides of the aisle saying we should be developing a new generation of tax credits now that you have these prominent ones, the ITC and the PTC, phasing out over the next couple of years. And just one more slide here to sort of lead us off, which is power sector CO2 emissions over time and going out to 2030. And as you can see, emissions have come down lately, but we're not decarbonizing even the power sector in any real sense. So these dotted lines, even the bottom one is with some pretty aggressive technology assumptions with some work we've done with the Rhodium Group. And the trajectory is roughly flat. So it's clear we need more. Part of that story could be clean electricity tax credits. So that's why we are talking about that today. So 2 shout outs before I go on. Number 1, a shout out to the ClearPath Foundation, who in part is responsible for allowing this research to happen. And then number 2, to my co-author for this paper, who is Varun Sivaram. So Varun is the Chief Technology Officer for a company called Renew Power. That's India's largest renewable company. He's also a non-resident scholar with Julio and I at Columbia. Most importantly, he's just one of the most knowledgeable people on the planet when it comes to clean electricity. So the problem is, the place he is on the planet is India, and that's why he's not with us today, which is too bad. But wanted you to know he's involved. He's sort of the technology guy. I'm like the lowly economist here. So I'm fully reserving the right when Abby asks me some hard questions to play the Varun will know card when that comes out. I even made one that I can just wave around at you. We'll see how many times I use this. All right, so our goal, Varun and I set out to say, if policymakers are looking to design the next generation of clean electricity tax credits, what are some principles they can keep in mind? We came up with 3 principles. The first one is to tailor the tax incentives to the needs of a low-carbon electricity system. So if you knew exactly where you wanted to go in terms of a low-carbon system in the next couple decades, you could be totally technology specific, right? You could say, help the technologies that we want, don't help the ones we don't want. On the other hand, if you had no idea what you wanted the low-carbon electricity system to look like, you could be completely technology neutral, right? Just let the market decide what comes out. So we decided, like most things, the right answer is probably somewhere in the middle. We don't know exactly what we want the low-carbon electricity system to look like, but we do know a whole lot about ideal characteristics of a low-carbon grid. We want a lot of renewables. We want some, at least, dispatchable carbon-free power that can sort of support the intermittent renewables. We want storage. We want a lot of transmission. And we want a digitally enabled grid, particularly as we integrate more demand response technologies and electric vehicles on the grid. So our first principle says we should be moving forward with all of these sort of different buckets simultaneously. And within the buckets, we can be technology neutral, or at least as technology neutral as we can. The idea being, we know we want storage. We don't particularly necessarily care how we get the storage, so we design a tax credit that encourages storage. Our second principle is to align the tax credits with an overall innovation strategy. So here's a figure from our paper. Basically, the point we're making is that an innovation strategy is not just one policy, it's a set of policies. So you can think of it as an assembly line or a baton handoff, or any passing metaphor that you want to use. And basically what we're showing here is that on the graph you have the costs of the technology over time, and they start really high, right? When you're first developing a technology, it's really expensive, and frankly, it's usually not that good. And at that point, it's critical to have a lot of government involvement, because the private sector just isn't going to touch it. As costs come down, as the technology gets better, that's when tax incentives start to be a very useful tool. You can put them in place and sort of pull early stage technologies onto the commercial market. The problem arises when you have the tax incentives or sort of an early stage deployment policy, but you haven't actually developed the technologies that you need to be pulled onto the market. So I think Julio is going to talk a lot more about this point, but this has happened, right? We've seen this in recent years with advanced biofuels, for example. We have deployment policy, but we don't necessarily have the technology to sort of pull onto the market. So the one other thing I'll say about this is that the assembly line can't stop at the tax incentives, right? We also need a policy in place to deal with the mature clean technologies. Sort of common sense. You're never going to be able to produce electricity cheaper with just low carbon energy as you will with any energy source you want, right? Any energy source is always going to win, right? So that's why we need a technology that recognizes the sort of benefits of clean energy on the grid, even if it's mature. And we want that technology to look something like a price on carbon that aligns market signals correctly to take advantage of the clean technology benefits. So number 3, our third principle, Congress should pass a long-term incentive that sets clear guidelines that includes phasing out the incentive as technologies mature. So there's 2 parts to that. The first is the sort of clear guidelines long-term incentive. That's to avoid sort of starts and stops, which we've seen over the years, things like the production tax credit, how it had sort of gone away or threatened to go away every 2 years. That chills the investment environment. And the whole point of these technologies is to encourage private sector investment. So we don't want that. And then the second part about the incentive ramping down as technologies mature. Tax credits are just the wrong technology or the wrong policy for mature technologies. We can do it in a sort of cheaper way. They can distort markets. They can lock in technologies that are inferior. And we just have better tools in our toolbox. So those are our 3 principles. They're pretty high level. That's in part because each of the design elements need really careful study of the grid's needs and the specific technologies, and that's just beyond the scope of our project. But it's not just that we're lazy. There's also the aspect that there just are no right answers to a lot of these things, right? Something like when these baton handoffs should happen, how exactly you structure the phase out. We give some options in our paper, but in a lot of ways, it's as much of an art as it is a science. So, fortunately for all of us, sitting here is a gentleman who is both an artist and a scientist in Julio Friedmann. So I am looking forward to hearing what he has to say about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Noah. It's really a treat to be here. Thank you all for attending. Can you figure out how the presentation gets up? Thank you. And I do again want to call out 2 things. First and foremost, I want to call out the extraordinary paper which Varun and Noah have written. I encourage you to go on the CGEP website and take a look at it. It's a good read, it's punchy and clear, and lays out these principles in some substance. In addition to that, again, I want to reiterate the fact that the work that we're doing here and have done is supported by CGEP and in part supported by the Clear Path Foundation, and we're very glad for that undertaking. So I wanted to talk about what it actually takes to get innovation going in terms of the policies, and in part, I have a different way of sort of representing the challenge that Noah had. He has sort of the biggest historical framework, which is the Pleistocene or the Pliocene, and the past several million years. Mine is actually a little more recent. And what you see here is basically all of emissions over the past 150 years, and then forward from there. And the punchline for this is in order to stay even at 2 degrees, which is already terrible, 2 degrees is already a pretty bad world, as the IPCC report shows, we have to decarbonize faster than we carbonized, and there's no precedent for that in human history. We've never tried anything like that ever. Our mojo has always been more of everything. In fact, we still don't use less of anything in the world. We still use more wood than we used to. we use more of everything. And so to have an energy-rich, sustainable future, and you want that, you want one where energy access is wide and we have abundant energy that is low cost, we must negate emissions faster than they grew. That's really hard. And we must grow electrical supply globally if we want to feed that part of the system. Because there are many parts of the world which are still not electrified or have very, very small volumes of electrical use. And then eventually we need to go negative. If you take a look at this, to quote Roy Scheider from Jaws, we need a bigger boat. We just do not have the options that we want or need to accomplish all that today at a price that we all think makes sense. So it's worth asking, what does the US power market look like in that context? And the punchline is it's flat, flat, flat. It's flat. We are not adding a lot of generation. Today, generation is about 1,000 gigawatts of summer generation. And we generate about 4,000 terawatt hours of power every year. And those have been true for a long time. It's also the case that per capita, it hasn't changed much. We've dropped a little bit. We've had some benefit of efficiency improvements and so forth that have helped. But fundamentally, we haven't moved this much. It's still mostly gas, coal, and nuclear with some hydro and renewables. I've got a graph on that on the next slide to lay that out. Low carbon systems, in this case gas and renewables as a mix, are starting to displace coal. So like Noah said, we've had some emissions reductions. But the actual fraction of fossil energy generation is unchanged for about 40 years. It's flat. The price has also basically been flat. We've had some small price increases over the past couple of years. It's been about a cent, not even, like a tenth of a cent. It's pretty small. So that's good news. We've been able to get a certain amount of innovation going without changing the price dramatically. But it fundamentally means that new generation replaces existing generation, either by a plant's retirement, you build something new, or by changing the capacity factors, say increasing the capacity factors for renewables and decreasing the capacity factors for nuclear and fossil. It's important to know that because that's part of the reason why the emissions are not changing at the rate we need. There is a potential for new loads, things like electric vehicles, but we don't really know what that looks like, and we don't know whether power demand will grow or not. So thinking about it as a flat system is reasonable. And like I said, we've never used less of anything. This is the mix since the 1950, basically, so for the past 60 years. And we have had some substantial growth of renewable power in the form of wind and solar. But fundamentally, that's still a pretty small fraction of the mix. You know, we just need more options and we need better options. If we want to move at speed, if we want a clean, reliable, resilient grid, we just need more. So how do you get more? What's the recipe? That's a fair thing to ask. Before the recipe, though, is what's the cost? That's the first thing people say. How do we think of these options today? As I said before, power options in the United States are actually pretty cheap. We're at about $100 a megawatt hour or 10 cents a kilowatt hour. That's a good way to think about it. These are the unsubsidized levelized cost of electricity from Lazard. They publish them every year. All the assumptions are in it. Dig in. There's a lot of information that's valuable and useful. Here's the way that I like to think about this. Today, that's about where we're at price-wise. And it's nice to be below that. It'd be nicer to have cheaper power than that. So it'd be good if we could generate options that are low-carbon power that are cheaper. Where we really need to be, though, is here. We really need to be about half that price. If we really want to start electrifying things that we care about, we need even cheaper power. So we have to decarbonize and make it cheaper and grow the system. It's a very tough design criteria. All of this is another way of saying why we need more. The good news is we know the recipe. This is Noah's figure from earlier. And I wanted to point out that you need all of these things. You need research and development, you need demonstration, you need deployment, and different policies fit in on this. I'm going to focus a bit on that first one, RD&D funding, and in part because that's one of the principles that Noah laid out. You actually need to align these things if you want the right outcome. And again, we know the recipe. the recipe is actually pretty straightforward, and we've done it over and over and over again, so we know how to do it again. It's sustained RD&D. That brings the new technologies to market, and then you provide incentives that align those markets to those technology options, whether they're tax credits or some other thing. And these are just one of the more iconic ones. This is the solar module costs. You can see how they've dropped over time. Basically, a factor of 100 almost price decrease recently being since the 70s. And that has the module cost on one side. On the other side, we actually have the levelized cost of the whole integrated system, which has also shown these dramatic drops. And you'll see there's these kinks. There are these places where you have dramatic learning rates, and then it kind of flattens out, and then you can get dramatic learning rates, and it flattens out. It's worth asking what that's about. It turns out there's an incredibly deep literature on learning rates and what they mean and how to interpret them and stuff like that. And this is just one example. These are the different learning rates estimates for how much we've reduced the cost of natural gas turbines over time. Just any power technology, in this case, natural gas turbines. You'll see there's actually a pretty wide spread. There isn't one number. And part of the reason is because they started at different times, they started in different markets, there were different conditions and so forth. People like to think about these things as, well, there's always one number, there's always one answer. Like, no, these things are contingent on a lot of things in the economy and the policy environment and all these other things. But you can still sort of eyeball this here and say, I don't know, 10 to 15% seems like a reasonable aggregate median number, and that actually proves to be true in a lot of the cases. So, if you take a look at what that actually looks like over time, you can find a pretty linear fit, but in fact that linear fit's wrong. This is one of the things that's important about understanding this. The learning rate actually changes through time, in part because of an R&D investment. And we've seen this over and over again. It's actually two learning rates, one of which is fast and one of which is slow. And one of the most robust findings of the people who've looked at this over and over and over again is that the faster learning rates come when you put the R&D investment in. And if you don't have that, the learning rate is slow. It's not actually that hard. What I mean by learning rates here is actually associated with the doubling of deployment. When you go from 1 gigawatt to 2 gigawatts or 2 gigawatts to 4 gigawatts, that's a doubling. And a learning rate, in this case, let's say you had a 19% learning rate, that means every time you double, you have a 19% cost reduction. That's how that works. And so these kind of forms of curves, you see this all the time. So I want to go back to the ones I showed you a second ago to tee up what this means for a whole bunch of clean energy technologies. Here's the ones you saw before, right? This is actually 3 different learning curves. The first one was really fast, 30% learning. That was not accidental. There was a lot going on in the world at that time. Among other things, we had the Arab oil embargo. We started the Department of Energy. The International Energy Agency was formed. But we had the highest ever investment in energy R&D, and a lot of that went to solar. Unsurprisingly, they moved quickly and fast and were able to find ways to reduce the cost well through a whole bunch of things, improved manufacturing, better crystal growth, all this sort of stuff. At some point, it tapers off, because you just can't do that forever. We still made progress, we still got deployment, but the learning rate was substantially slower. 20% learning rate instead of 30% learning rate, ballpark. That changed again, and again, I would posit that there's a bunch of things that came into it, but the R&D investment was actually very important for this. We had the Energiewende, which created a market. We had the solar investment tax credit, which created market pull. But we also had the Sunshot Initiative, and most importantly, China dumped a huge amount of money into industrial R&D to try to figure out how to manufacture this stuff quickly. And you got a 50% learning rate. It was incredibly fast. And it was associated with what Noah had talked about before, an alignment between RD&D structure and policy and what you wanted to get in terms of deployment. And in this case, bizarrely, China and Germany sort of worked like a tandem market or a tandem policy center, where the R&D investment came from China and the market pull came from Germany, and that's how they got the alignment. I'll come back to that in a little bit. If you look at the levelized cost piece, you get a similar kind of story. 2 different learning rates, 12% at the beginning, 8% after that. And those are associated, again, with things like the steep learning curve that you see there, the appearance of Sunshot, the Chinese R&D program, is where you get the fast learning rates. So as one case study on this, I'm going to talk about utility scale solar, and I want to talk about the Loan Program Office. The number of utility scale solar plants in the world in 2005 was 0. There were none. By utility scale here, I mean bigger than 100 megawatts. All right? And so, by 2016, it looks pretty different. We have 21 gigawatts. That number has since grown to about 34 gigawatts. And about 50% of that growth happened in 2 years, 2015 and 2016. A huge, huge piece of work that went on. And you can see that, again, there's kind of a little kink in the curve. And you can see what happened sort of in there. You had a couple of plants in 2009, but then suddenly you got this explosion of plants. I want to be clear, in part, that was associated with things like the solar production investment tax credit, and that tax credit definitely stimulated the market. It also, however, coincided with the deployment R&D and D strategy out of the Loan Program Office. In 2011, the Loan Program Office inked a bunch of deals, and we went from 0 in the United States to 6. And they said, we're just going to cover the risk associated with this. It's a loan, but we're going to give good terms and good tenor. We're going to, in some cases, give a loan guarantee. You still have to pay us back. Part of what made that possible was the solar tax credit, which provided power purchase agreements so that they could help finance this stuff. But the low-cost capital for deployment absolutely made that possible. What happened was those were inked in 2011. They were built a couple of years later, and by 2016, you had 45 of these things instead of 6. One of the things I've learned in government and the private sector is actually if you build one of anything, that's not enough to get it to market. One is not enough. You build one CCS plant, you build one nuclear plant, you build one solar concentrating tower. Investors look at that and go, well, one's nice, but how much is it going to come down in cost? Have we really de-risked it? Do we understand all the things we need to do? They're not satisfied with one. So if we need more than one project, as innovation policy, how can you think about this? And I have a modest proposal. Just a simple thing to think about. N equals 4. We have to go from 1 unit to 4 units, which is 2 doublings, by the way. So you can establish the trajectory of the learning curve through 2 doublings. I sort of arbitrarily said here 1 gigawatt in size. 1 gigawatt was not necessary for solar. A bunch of the solar projects were on the order of 200 megawatts to 500 megawatts, and that was big enough to understand the balance of system and balance of plant and whatever is necessary. But you need something that's big in order to get this going. So part of the scholarship that we're doing at the Center for Global Energy Policy is trying to understand what this might look like across a suite of clean energy technologies, specifically clean power technologies. And we're looking at something between 0.5% to 2% of the US market, which turns out to be about, 2 gigawatts. 2 gigawatts is 2% of US generation. So you have to get through a handful of these things to get going, and what does that look like? We're inputting sets of technologies. Their current market prices are for the things that haven't been built yet, the best estimate of what that looks like. Trying to get a sense of what it looks like for the 1,000 gigawatt market. And then we're adding assumptions in the form of the best price estimate we have. We're choosing learning rates as a function of the kind of technology. So we know, for example, that big, heavy equipment learns slower than modular equipment, like we know that. So if you're innovating in a solar panel or a battery, you can go faster in terms of the learning rate than you can with, say, a small modular reactor. And that's a sort of a safe kind of assumption to make into this. And we're comparing an accelerated learning curve for the first 0.5% of the market, just to get a sense for if you align those incentives and got that stuff deployed and you had a faster learning rate, how would that affect cost, how would that affect price, and what would it look like in terms of deployment? These are the examples of technologies we're looking at: zero-emission fossil fuels, small modular reactors, next-generation solar, things like perovskites or multi-exciton junctions, advanced power storage, what's beyond lithium-ion batteries, novel formulations, everything from solid state to novel chemistries, and even stuff like high-altitude or airborne wind, which is extremely promising. And again, we haven't built any of these things yet, because we need more options. We need to get these things in the market. The only thing I'm going to show today is sort of a very preliminary analysis around the CCS retrofit for an existing natural gas plant. It's just one example of what a policy could look like. Please be very skeptical of these estimates. As I said, there's a lot of assumptions that are baked into them, and there's a range of outcomes and a range of numbers. I say this because it's important. Don't choose a number, don't declare a product. There's a bunch of stuff that goes into this, and there's a lot of hair here. But I still wanted to share some preliminary results to give you a sense of what this looks like. These are in different sets. This is the cost for power. This is the CO2 reduction cost. And then this is the additional cost. So for power cost, that's what it would look like in terms of the actual price in the market. That red arrow is the range at 1 gigawatt of generation. And then those curves are different learning rates. I'll explain those in a minute. CO2 cost reduction, carbon capture is the only one of these things where you have a dollar per ton number that's robust, and everyone talks about CCS as dollars per ton, so I put up dollars per ton. Often people say CCS always costs more, it's an additional cost, how do you manage that? So separate from that, I didn't want to just have the total power cost, I wanted to show what it would look like in terms of additional incremental cost to the grid. Because we want to have solutions that come in at 5 cents, how do we get there, okay? So this is what those are. And across that range, basically the upper pair of learning curves in this case is about 8% learning rate. The lower sets of curves basically have a 15% learning rate just for the first 2 doublings, just for the first 4 units. And then after that, revert to the other learning rate. So the only thing we're measuring here is what happens if you get a higher learning rate due to investment and deployment through things like a demonstration program or the loan program officer, stuff like that. So again, these are just meant to give you a sense of what's going on in here. The punchline for me is that instead of today where we're, say, 2.5 cents to 3.5 cents of additional cost to retrofit a natural gas plant, you can imagine that if we had these kinds of alignment of tax credits, we could drop that substantially. We could drop that from, say, 3.5 cents to 2.5 cents, or from 2.5 cents to 1.5 cents. There's actually a lot of savings that come from that. But if you put that emphasis on the early deployment, you get there almost immediately. You get there by 0.5% of the market instead of by 2% of the market. You basically are shaving years off of this, and you're adding savings to the ratepayers and to the republic. And the same thing is true for all of these things. You can see how big the delta is. You could basically shave $10 a ton off of this by just getting early deployment, by having that incentive around the RD&D piece. So to summarize again, we know the recipe. We still need this stuff. I love the tax credits. I think they're great. But if you really want speed, if you want traction, if you want to get this stuff to market, you need more than that simple policy. And policy around the innovation agenda is helpful. We don't have enough options. We don't have enough validation of the cost of these things. We've got to take more shots on net. The RD&D should be paired and structured with these complementary incentives. And again, modest proposal of n equals 4. Finally, demonstrations ultimately end up being regional. These things don't go in America, they go in New Jersey. Like there's a place that they live, and there's local permitting issues, there's local markets, there's local dispatch, FERC has something to say about it, the Local Public Utilities Commission says about this. So you actually have to try these things in some ways across some geographic range to try to understand what that's done. I have to underscore that middle point down there. You cannot presage the outcome. I really wish I had a crystal ball. Somebody once said, we don't want to choose winners and losers, we just want to choose winners. And the bottom line is we don't know how to do that. So ultimately, though, we have to try many things. And if we do, and if we put enough money behind it and we align them with these kinds of tax incentives, then the winners are the citizens and the ratepayers. Thank you.
All right. Okay, great. This works. I always get scared that I'm going to be the person who gets up here and then tries to turn on the mic and it never turns on. So glad that's not happening to me. We're going to move on to some discussion now. We're going to have about 15 minutes of discussion up here with the three of us, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Just again, for those who are watching online, my name is Abby Smith. I'm a reporter with Bloomberg Environment. We're here with Noah Kaufman and Julio Friedmann, who just presented on clean electricity tax credits and RD&D. So let's move to the discussion, and we'll open it up for questions from the audience in a little bit. For those of you who are here in person, just raise your hand and we'll come over to you and we'll bring a microphone. For those watching online, you can ask a question using the hashtag CGEP events or tagging the Twitter handle Columbia U Energy. So let's start with Noah here. We're talking about the next generation of clean electricity tax credits, but I want to take a step back and talk first about the current ones we have in place here. And you and Varun state clearly in the paper that it makes sense to let the current tax credits for wind and solar energy expire, as they're set to do next year for wind and 2022 for most solar projects. But we know how these things go on the Hill. There are some Democrats who are already talking about maybe we should extend those again. Circumstances have changed since 2015 when they made the deal to phase them out. We've got an administration that's reversing course on climate regulations, pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement, placing tariffs on solar panels. So what do you make of their argument here? Should these tax credits be extended again, even with these circumstances that have changed?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Our work, we try to be very policy relevant, but in some ways we're fortunate that we get to live in a bit of a fantasy land and say, here's what you should do if you would ignore all those messy political constraints. So in some ways, I would say we're not letting policymakers off the hook by saying, just go ahead and extend the tax credits, which are imperfect in a lot of ways. Maybe it's better than doing absolutely nothing, but that's not the exercise we were looking at. We were saying, if we're going to think about starting over with a new generation of tax credits, ideally combined with a broader power sector strategy and sort of economy-wide climate strategy, this is how we would do it. So I guess our message is aim higher.
Aim higher, and wind and solar technologies at this point, would they reach the maturity scale that you're envisioning, in these new generation of tax credits, where they would kind of phase out of those tax credits because they're a little bit more mature now?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and it of course depends on the types of wind and solar that you're talking about. But I think the ones we're deploying the most today have gotten fairly mature. So it's probably time for the wind and solar industry to sort of join the rest of the pack and say, yes, we still do need policy for mature technologies also. Let's fight for that sort of climate policy as opposed to technology-specific incentives.
Sure, and moving to some of these maybe more nascent technologies, Julio, you talked a lot about dovetailing any sort of new tax incentives with the technology push of federal research and development programs, and better linking those programs with the outcomes those incentives would work to foster. So say you went back to your old stomping grounds at the Energy Department, and you were given full reign to retool the agency's R&D program to accomplish these goals. How do you do it? What are some of the most important changes you would make?
So let's hope that I have the chance to do that, but assuming that I don't, of course, the first thing I would do is say, ask for big budget plus-ups, because what you can't do is you can't fund a demonstration out of basic research. Like this, they're completely different things. You cannot cannibalize one for the other. So if you want to have a program like the Loan Program Office or like the demonstration programs which we've had in nuclear and solar and wind and fossil, then you actually do need additional authorization, you need additional budget to do that. The next thing I would do is I would actually start getting granular. All of these things end up having an EPC contractor in them someplace. All of these things end up having an offtake agreement in there someplace. And at the end of the day, projects are never funded in a vacuum. Like they always have an exigency around them. But I would want to actually design some kind of process or some kind of guide that you can use to say, are we really serving America broadly as best as we can with this? So as one example, I'm actually pretty excited about the small modular reactor project that's going forward in Utah. And that's a six-pack, basically, of 50 megawatt reactors, and we're going to get a bunch of good stuff out of that. But I would look at that and then say, okay, well, if we really want to start scaling this into the market, we want a comparable demonstration program, we've de-risked it some. Maybe we give smaller grants to try to figure out what that does, and reasonable people would disagree, would want to scope it. But then I'd come out and say, how should we deploy these? Where should we deploy these so that we get the maximum learnings to the Republic as well as the maximum benefit to people who want to invest in this in the market. And you can't do it forever. We're not China. We don't mandate the building of power plants. It's all done in the private sector, and ultimately they have to take over. But it's reasonable to think how many more of these things do we need to do? In the back of my mind is always, for my money, the Petronova project, which I had the good fortune of actually working on and supporting at the DOE. I spent 10 years of my career talking to people about CCS, and they would always say, yeah, but you haven't gone out and retrofit a coal plant, so it doesn't really happen. Well, then we went out and retrofit a coal plant, and it happens. And then everybody says, well, it costs too much. We know from that project that the next project will cost 20% less, and by N equals 4, it'll be 40% less. We actually know that with high confidence. That doesn't mean an investor wants to invest in it yet. Even with the alignment of the tax credit, there's still risk there. We have to think about more projects to buy down that risk.
So speaking of carbon capture, there's a bill in the Senate right now from Senator Manchin and Senator Murkowski that would authorize some more money for carbon capture, carbon removal research and development, including carving out a role for demonstration project dollars. Is that a step in the right direction? Does Congress need to do more? Does it need to be more technology neutral or technology specific? What's your thoughts on the way they structure that?
Right, so if people are interested, I would encourage you to take a look at my testimony on the EFFECT Act, which I gave at SENR about a month ago, and my detailed answers are there. Fundamentally, those kind of authorizations are the sort of things you're talking about, and they provide a complete pipeline from basic research through large pilots and validation into demonstration, then functionally a transfer to the market. We had some authorizations under ARRA to do projects like that. Those were time limited, and actually a bunch of projects never got built because we just ran out of time. So designing the demonstration program and the funding around it is actually a whole thing that still needs to be done. I, for one, would be sad, I would be disappointed if it stayed only within one or two of the technology offices. We don't know what's going to do well in the market yet. We just know that we need to try more things. And so I would want to see similar kinds of authorizations and matched with appropriations across the technology office spectrum, including Office of Electrical Reliability, which really has smart grid issues they need to get their hands on, including solar and wind, and God bless geothermal. We need more of that too. And so same thing with batteries, and same thing with nuclear, and same thing with fossil. And none of that should come at the expense of, say, the Office of Science programs, which we also desperately need.
Yeah. And there's a couple other bills floating around in Congress, too, that seem to be heading down the path that NOAA, you all lay out in the paper in terms of tax incentives. We've got Senator Wyden's Clean Energy for America Act, Congressman Reid's Energy Sector Innovation Credit Act. So what do these bills get right, and what could they improve on? You know, what pieces of the puzzle do you think that they're missing?
Yeah, well, so in terms of what they get right, number one, I think a theme of Julio's presentation and my presentation was that we just need a lot more when it comes to clean energy. And in a Congress that's frankly not doing enough, they're showing leadership on the issue, and that's terrific. They're also sort of recognizing the principle that we talked about related to sort of moving from technology-specific deployment incentives to more of a technology-neutral once we get to that phase of the RD&D curve, sort of letting the market decide what the best technologies are. And I'd say Congressman Reid's proposal has a pretty innovative sort of phase-out schedule in it, where once technologies reach a certain market share, they begin to sort of slowly ramp down the incentive that they get. To say something nice about the Wyden bill, he recognizes that, you know, this is not just an electricity problem. We're talking about climate. That there's a portion in it that deals with transportation fuels also, which is, of course, critically important. I guess if I were to say something negative, it would be when it comes to the dealing of mature technologies, which, again, if you don't have policy to deal with mature technologies, you're just going to fall off that assembly line. You're not going to decarbonize. So from Congressman Reid, I'd love to see sort of his proposal of what happens next after this bill. And I think the Senate Democrat bill kind of applies these tax credits to the mature technologies also, to which I would say there are better policy tools.
Do you think, to follow up on that, do you think the biggest political fight, if we were to go down this path would be over how to phase out the credits and when to phase those out. I know you said that a lot of this is as much art as it is science. Is the art of that, determining when to phase out these credits, would that be a big political fight, do you think?
I mean, yeah, it's sort of easy for me to say what they should do, but I think it makes the idea of phasing out these subsidies becomes a lot easier if you present it as part of a more comprehensive plan. But when it comes to what the political fights would be, I would ask you, Abby, what you think the most difficult aspects of it would be, because you would know better than I would.
My crystal ball is a little cloudy, so I don't like to make predictions on what will be a political fight and how bitter that will be. So I want to open it up to get your audience questions here, but I'm going to ask one more, a lightning round question. So answer as short as you would tweet it. And given how active both of you are on energy Twitter, I know that you can do this. You're up for this challenge. So here's the question. When's the earliest you see major bipartisan climate legislation pass Congress, and what form will it take? Will it be the updated clean electricity tax credits we're talking about now? Will it be a clean energy standard, carbon tax, or a fee, some combination, or some possibility we may not even have thought of yet? Start with you, Noah, or Julio. Okay. Whoever wants to jump in first.
Yes, once more into the breach. Given what I see as the landscape, I'd say a clean energy standard is in pole position. It allows the highest ambition and the widest political encouragement. I think it will not pass this Congress, but it could pass as early as next Congress. Great.
Noah?
I'm going to invoke your lack of crystal ball and say I have absolutely no idea. But maybe I should play my Varun will know card.
Oh, so we've got to ask Varun. We got to call him up then.
Yeah.
All right, well, I've got loads more questions, but I want to give you all a chance here. So for those in the room, please raise your hand. We'll bring around a microphone. Please ask a question. Try to keep it short. We have minimal time. I want to get as many people as possible. For those online, we have questions on Twitter. Let me look back at my folks in the back to see what they want me to do on Twitter questions. Artilio, for Twitter. Okay, great. We'll move to the. She's engaged in all the Twitter conversations, I'm sure. So let's move to the audience first. Please raise your hand if you've got a question. If you don't, I'll keep asking them. All right over there.
For new technologies, why do you think tax credits are better than some sort of carbon pricing? And I ask that in the context of inherently tax credits are perceived as containing some risk by investors just because of the the way it's written into the code. So would it be better to have kind of a understood pricing mechanism to support new technologies versus the tax credit?
Well, I guess, so my answer to that is that I wouldn't say one is better than the other. I would say they can complement each other very nicely. So I threw this slide back up there, the carbon pricing is terrific, both in terms of encouraging, emissions reductions, wherever and however they're most cost effective, but they only encourage those reductions if the technologies are present and far enough along down that learning curve so that the difference in cost between the dirty technology and the clean technology, is less than the size of the carbon price. So before that, you need all of this sort of innovation to happen, and at the tail end of that innovation is where your tax credit can be useful. So hope that's not a cop-out, but I think they can go together.
And please introduce yourself and where you're from. I should have said that earlier. That's my bad.
Scott Baker from PJM Interconnection. I'm curious how you think about the timing of those 4 projects as you put it out. Because in hindsight, it feels like those 6 utility-scale solar projects were timed right for the loan program. And I'm just curious about how you think about the different technologies out there and when the right time for the loan program office to step in is.
So I'd revert back to one of Noah's principles. One of the reasons why that timing worked out well is there was actually an alignment with tax incentive and other policies. So there was a combination of, 50 years of investment in innovation from the basic R&D to the point where people could think about a utility scale. So that part of the timing was right. But also, you actually now had some market pull in the form of these tax credits, and the Loan Program Office was able to align with those other policies so that the deployment didn't just happen in a vacuum. In contraposition, or as a counterexample to that, we put $14 billion on the table, $8 billion on the table for fossil projects, of which we got none approved because there wasn't a market pull to align with them. So you really want those things to twin if you want to get the cost reductions and the deployment to market. There's also a specific limitation of the LPO, the Loan Program Office, which is that it must be an innovative technology. And innovative is a term of art which is defined. But one of the things it means is that it's actually hard to get 3 or 4 of the same thing, because that's not innovative anymore. And so, again, reasonable people will disagree about how to sort of thread that needle, but fundamentally, you need to sort of take those under consideration. As a more discrete answer to your question, I would like to see a demonstration program like that happen in concert with something like a clean energy standard or a technology agnostic ITC plus PTC, specifically to get that kind of uptake.
Hi, I'm Jake Raskoff with Senator Brian Schatz. Do you think that the existing tax equity market is the most effective way to support these technologies, or would you prefer to see some reforms like making the credits refundable or converting them to grants?
Yeah, so I won't speak for Noah on this one. I'll speak just for myself. If the tax credits could be refundable and or transferable, that would certainly increase the market ease and appetite around them. So if the point is deployment and uptake, that would be helpful. I also think that tax equity exchanges are sort of inherently inviting in a bunch of middlemen. Like again, asking how to structure those things or how they may work, reasonable people will disagree. I think those tax equity exchange markets have worked remarkably well. People have also innovated business models around them to come up with stuff like leasing agreements, which was an alternative structure to the tax equity exchanges. And so all of that's good. What I have found impressive is how little understanding there is outside of one technology in those markets. The people who do wind understand wind. The people who do solar understand solar. And when we bring them 45Q or 45J, they go, huh? They don't even know it exists, and they don't really understand those markets. They don't quite know how to functionalize them. And so there's actually an uptake and maturation associated with those markets just the same way that there is with the technologies themselves.
Michael Weingartner, Senator Murkowski's office. Has there been a discernible impact for federal tax incentives when it comes to regulated versus deregulated electricity markets?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, that's a toughie. Part of the reason why that's tough is because there's so much wholesale retreading of these markets in the utility model in the first place. A lot of the utilities have moved to a market where they're not generators at all. They're just transmission distribution companies, and they're just buying from merchants. And so there's a different way that I would say that, which is I've talked to a handful of utilities that are still regulated utilities. And I said, $50 tax credit, would you take it? And they were like, nah. I said, $100 tax credit, would you take it? And they're like, meh. I was like, $100 carbon tax, would it move the needle? They're like, not really. And then I say, how about 11% guaranteed rate of return? And they're like, we would have built the plant yesterday. So part of the reason why I'm enthusiastic about something like a clean energy standard per se is it actually gives regulatory freedom to public utilities commissions and to FERC to incorporate some of these things into the rate base. And today they don't have a statutory pathway to do that. Even with a tax credit, it's not really PUC's job to save the taxpayers or the merchants money. Their job is low power and obligations to law. And so if they had a legal standard that required 100% clean, then they could be much more creative about the kinds of plants they would work. It would also allow outfits like PJM to go to all these groups and say, you know what, we're a balancing authority. We can take that risk off of you for, say, 2 cents a kilowatt hour, and we'll just balance the entire system at low carbon and give you 100% clean. But absent that kind of a standard, the tax credits are, I mean, they're still helpful, but they're not the same thing as rate recovery for a regulated utility. It is a fair question to ask whether we want to support the regulated utility model or not. I'm not going to answer that question. I don't really have a dog in that fight.
And I'll just say, despite what Julio's contact thought, we've done the analysis, and a $100 carbon tax would absolutely move the needle.
A little bit of disagreement on the phone.
Well, it would certainly move the needle for the merchants. They'd be all over it.
My name is Matt Ornstein, just a visitor. I own a real estate development company, and we invest in a lot of real estate and a lot of development projects. One thing I just want, it's not really a question, but it's something I want to put out there for people that are working with Congress on tax incentives. There's an incredible amount of real estate that people don't have to necessarily pay for on rooftops of existing buildings. And also, if you're building a building from scratch, it's almost like free real estate on the rooftops. I mean, there's millions and millions of, square miles of rooftops in the United States that don't have solar on them. And this only relates to solar. I've been to a lot of presentations, and I've talked to all of my friends that are in the business, and I say, why don't you have solar on your rooftops? And it comes back to what Julio said. They all said the return on our capital is not high enough. And as a real estate developer and a real estate investor, to entice people in the real estate industry, people that own real estate currently or developing real estate, you have to provide a return on capital somewhere at the low end of 10% up to probably a maximum of 15%, meaning for every dollar that they spend, they're going to save 10 to 15 cents per year. So it's a payback period of 7 to 10 years. So I would like to just recommend that when you're talking to people in Congress about tax incentives or combination of tax credits for solar or accelerated depreciation rules for solar panels on rooftops, to get a lot of traction and deployment of solar panels on rooftops, whether it's apartments, whether it's industrial distribution centers, office buildings, Walmarts, Home Depots, things like this, you have to communicate to the business people in terms of return on capital. And it's also called internal rate of return. And the tax incentives, I just want to let you know, it's got to be between a minimum of 10% return on capital per year or internal rate of return, probably up to a maximum of 15% internal rate of return on their capital expenditures to install those solar panels to get them interested. So I just want to put that out there. That's why all of my friends have said we don't have solar panels on any of our stuff. The return on the investment is not high enough.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I think I wouldn't doubt any of that. I guess the one thing I would say, though, is we should, from the policymaker's perspective, you got to keep in mind what the objective is, right, of the policy. So if your objective is more solar panels on rooftops, you do one thing. If your objective is lower economy-wide emissions, you might do something different, right? So I think you always have to start with what your objective is and sort of work backwards to your policy tools.
There's a corollary to that, too. And having been inside and outside the fishbowl, I have some feeling for this. A commonly asked question inside of government is, what's the role of government? It is constantly asked, especially if you're using taxpayer money. They're really like, well, we're using taxpayer money, what's our role here? A common pushback that I get from the kind of thing that you said is that it's not actually the job of Congress to guarantee a hurdle rate or an IRR for anybody. It's to serve some public good. And so it's sort of a corollary around Noah's thing. Like, maybe we want more solar panels on buildings, maybe we don't. But what's the actual objective to serve the public, and what's the minimal policy action we can take to serve that in terms of cost to the Treasury or in terms of disruption in the system? How do we maximize resilience, avoid cyber threats? There's a lot of dimensionality to these things, but it always starts with what's the role of government in this. And they basically say, well, we're going to serve the public, and then clever businessmen will go out and figure out novel business models to finance it. And in fact, a lot of that's happening. I have been impressed at the agility of small community-scale solar, specifically because they're trying to come up with a business model that gets around the hurdle rate for the landowner. I am a serious clean energy guy, and I don't have solar on my house because it costs too much for me. I don't get that IRR, period. But I actually now have in my town a community solar option where I can get the cost and the benefit of that through a different business model without paying that capital myself, and they benefit from it, and there's more jobs and there's more construction and so forth. The land use issue is a different one, but that would serve the same goal and provide an alternative pathway and prove ultimately cheaper and in some ways more resilient.
All right, we've got time for one more quick question, as long as it's very quick. Anyone have one? No more questions. All right, we'll leave it at that then. Well, thank you again all for joining us. As I mentioned earlier, the full video and recording of this event will be available on the Columbia Center for Global Energy Policy website in a few days. For upcoming events, visit the Center on Global Energy Policy online. We hope to see you again soon. Thanks, and have a wonderful afternoon. Thanks all.
Right back at you. Thank you.